All right. So I'm going to bring it down to a little more serious now today. So my name is Miss Aunt Mary Lawrence. And as we enter into Holy Week, I wanted to spend some time reflecting on Christ's suffering, the nature of suffering, and how we can unite our sufferings to the cross of Christ. And I always like to begin with the end in mind. Aristotle tells us that the only thing we desire for its own sake is happiness. All the other things that we want and desire in this life, money, clothes, popularity, friends, we want because we think that they will make us happy. And in Latin, there are two words for happiness: felicity and beatitude. Felicity is happiness that we feel when we do something that we enjoy, like when I drink coffee, or read Shakespeare, or talk about Hector, or teach. These things make me really happy, and so they create a felicitous moment. While we do seek experiences of felicity, the trouble with them is that they will always come to an end. Because felicity is contentment in earthly enjoyments and delights, we know that they are fleeting. Beatitude, on the other hand, is perfect, fulfilling, eternal happiness, which can only be attained in heaven with God. Throughout this Lent, we have all given up moments of felicity, whether that is not having the candy that we enjoy or not being on social media, so that we can prepare ourselves better for beatitude. This is so that we can rightly orient our priorities towards that which will ultimately make us happy. Without the eyes of faith, our Lenten practices of self-denial would seem counterproductive to this desire for happiness. The world would tell us that if we want happiness, we just have to grab at every pleasurable experience, which is how you get the philosophy of the hedonist, whose whole point in life was to just get as much pleasure as you can. But as people who have Christ as our goal, we know that the pleasure of this life will not ultimately satisfy the deepest longings of our heart. Therefore, we have spent the past 6 weeks training our desires to long for God and not for ourselves. Just as the little sacrifices that we make during Lent can be great acts of love of God, so too can the sufferings of this life that we do not choose be reminders of our eternal home. Any of you who have me as a teacher know that I like defining terms. So suffering is defined as the state of undergoing pain or hardship. Any person who has ever lived on this earth has experienced hardship, has experienced this suffering. And this was the result of the fall of man. And we experience this literally every day of our lives. Even when we have beautiful moments of felicity, we know that they cannot last. And therefore, even the experience of ending a beautiful conversation with a friend is tinged with pain. In addition to our suffering, I want to talk about compassion, or suffering with another. This is the pain that we experience out of love for someone else who is enduring a hardship. I remember that the day when my oldest brother, same brother who had his 5th child today, when he had his first baby, he called us from the hospital, and his wife was undergoing a really, really difficult labor. I almost never see my brother cry, and he was sobbing on the phone because his wife was in tremendous pain, and he could do nothing to relieve it other than be physically present to her. When we patiently accept the sufferings that come to us in this life, we always have an opportunity to suffer with our Lord, whose heart breaks at the evils of this world much more than ours do. God, in his infinite wisdom and power, chose to redeem the world through his own suffering. In the crucifixion, Christ showed us both the depth of his love and the evil of sin. God could have chosen to redeem man through other, less horrific means, but his choosing suffering as an act of love teaches us how we can reciprocate that love back to God. In his passion, Christ teaches us that perfect obedience to the will of God, even when his will is incredibly painful. This is the surest way to salvation and ultimately to our own happiness. In our lives, People show their love for us through their willingness to suffer on our behalf. Parents constantly show their love for their children by sacrificing their own wants and desires for the good of their children. One way that I experienced this was in college. When you get to college, you'll realize that you will move a ton, all the time. It'll just be lots and lots of moving. And whenever my parents helped me move from house to house to house, I always felt profoundly loved by them because they were getting nothing out of it. And it was gross and you're sweating and it was hot because it's always in June or August. And they were just doing this because they loved me. We show our love for our friends when we lovingly call them out for choosing something that is destructive for them, even if we know they won't receive it well or that they'll be angry with us. It is through these acts of self-denial that we show those around us that they are more important to us than our own wants and comfort, that we love them despite what it may cost us. Father Jacques Philippe, in his book, Searching for and Maintaining Peace, writes, "We often have to experience failures, trials, humiliations, permitted by God, before the truth that we can do nothing on our own imposes itself on us. Not only on an intellectual level, but as an experience of our entire being. God would spare us, if he could, all these trials, but they are necessary in order that we should be convinced of our complete powerlessness to do good by ourselves." God uses the suffering that we experience in our lives, or in the lives of others, to call attention to the reality that we cannot get too comfortable here on this earth, that we need to raise our vision above trivialities, above the things that do not and cannot ultimately satisfy our hearts. There are two main ways that the Lord has worked in my life through suffering, through which he has called me on to deeper union and deeper trust in him. The first was through the loss of my dad. In July of 2020, my dad very suddenly passed away, and it left our whole family in shock. I was grappling with the world-shattering reality that someone whom I loved and who was such an immense presence in my life was suddenly and irrevocably gone. Even on that day, my mind kept thinking of the future and thinking of all the family events that my dad wouldn't be at, that he would never see my sister get married, or he'd never meet some of his grandchildren. But as I was preparing for this talk, I went back through my prayer journal and read my entry for the day after my dad died. And even then, I had written about how God was present in the midst of the shock, the numbness, and the sorrow. As I reflected on what the Lord was doing in my heart throughout the following weeks, I realized that the Lord had been preparing me for this. All of the books that I had been reading prior to my dad's passing had been books about death and suffering, and how to see God in the midst of suffering. The most profound fruit of my dad's passing was a greater detachment in me from the things of this world, and a more earnest desire for heaven. My ephemeral vision of perfect happiness in this life collapsed utterly. The illusion that I could be happy here was totally gone, because my dad was gone, and I would never see him here again. The loss of my dad made heaven much more real to me and tangible because someone I knew and loved was there. Being a teacher is another way that the Lord has helped orient me towards heaven. The very worst part of teaching for me that no one in the College of Education at Madonna University could have prepared me for is knowing that I will spend so much time getting to know and love my students every year. And every year when they graduate, they leave me. But every year after graduation, as I'm literally crying after graduation and praying, the Lord reminds me that one day I will get to see them all again, where we will be in heaven together, and that any person that we have loved on this earth will be united in happiness forever. Suffering in this life detaches us from the alluring pleasures of this world, so that we can fix our eyes on the eternal happiness for which we were made. God is constantly calling us to himself, but often we become too content with our lives to really live courageously and virtuously and passionately. So he uses the suffering that we experience as a wake-up call that this isn't our true home. C.S. Lewis put it this way: "We can ignore pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a sleeping world." Now that we've established why God might allow us to experience hardship in this life, I want to consider Christ's particular suffering for us that we will commemorate this Friday. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, my main man, said that if we want to love God, we need to begin our reflection with John 19:37. They will look on him whom they have pierced. I want to focus on each part of this passage. First, they will look on him. There is something very significant in what we choose to gaze at. When I think about love and gazing, I first think of Romeo and Juliet. When Romeo sees Juliet for the very first time, his heart literally stops, and he says, "Did my heart love till now, or swear at sight, for I ne'er saw true beauty till this night." Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. Romeo is captivated by the beauty of Juliet, and that is the beginning of his love for her. But it is not the end. And as I was writing this talk, my sister was like, "No, the end is much, much worse." Romeo continues to gaze on the one whom he loves and experiences the joy of that love and her reciprocation of his gaze. The other person that I think of when I think of love and gazing is Dante from the Divine Comedy. It is a very long 3-part Italian poem in which the character Dante travels through hell, purgatory, and heaven. And at the very end of the poem, after he has described innumerable people and places that he has seen, Dante finally gets to see God face to face and says, "Here my powers rest from their high fantasy, and already I could feel my being turned, instinct and intellect balanced equally, as if in a wheel whose motion nothing jars, by the love that moves the sun and all the other stars." Dante is so taken by the pure love and beauty of God that sets the whole world in motion that he cannot describe it, that he lets his poetic powers rest so that he can just gaze on him whom he loves. Love shows itself by wanting to be with the beloved, by wanting to be in their presence. Nothing more could satisfy Dante. He didn't continue to desire his great work because he had reached the one whom he was searching for. And he recognized that here at last was the end of all of his strivings. Here at last was the one whom he loved, just as it says in the Song of Songs. So much for gazing in love. I now want to look at that second part. They will look on him whom they have pierced. We are the ones looking at God. We are also the ones who pierced him. At first, this might seem counterintuitive to us. In contrast to staring at the one whom we love, often we try to avoid the gaze of people whom we have hurt, out of a sense of shame and guilt for what we have done. In some ways, this shows in us a healthy knowledge that we have done wrong. Nevertheless, this is not what God desires of us. He wants us to look at him, to gaze at him with the eyes of love, with the eyes of Romeo and the eyes of Dante, to behold him in his agony just as he gazes at us in our agonies in this world. Christ suffered for our sakes. We must be willing to look at the cost of our personal sin. We must understand the price he paid for us if we ever hope to reject the lies of this world and to live for him. We must look at the reality of what our sinful choices brought Jesus to. Every sin that we try to convince ourselves is not actually a big deal. every selfish, self-centered, self-motivated act cost Jesus everything. There's a beautiful Good Friday hymn entitled "Ah, Holy Jesus" that I love to reflect on during this week. One of the verses says, "Who was the guilty? Who brought this upon thee? Alas, my treason, Jesus, hath undone thee. 'Twas I, Lord Jesus, I it was denied thee. I crucified thee." If we are going to love Jesus, we must be willing to be honest about our sins, to be honest about the ways in which we have betrayed Jesus, and then to continue to gaze at him, especially in his suffering on the cross, because in that act, he loved us with the greatest love. We need to accept both that we do not deserve his love, and at the same time that we are infinitely loved by him. We can never repay him, but we can be with him. We can stay with him in his agony and gaze on him whom we have pierced. The question then becomes, how do we continue to fix our eyes on Christ in the middle of our suffering? There are only two things, actually, that I would recommend for enduring suffering out of love for Christ. And the first is this: do not deny that what you are experiencing is a suffering. Often we try to downplay our experiences because we know that other people have it worse than we do. Comparing crosses will not get us anywhere. Why God chooses particular crosses for particular people is up to his judgment and not ours. The only way to embrace the cross that you have been given is first to admit that it is in fact a cross. Any unpleasant experience can become efficacious for our salvation if offered to Christ. Whether it's something as minor as frustration about slow traffic, or something as painful as the rejection of a friend. Tell the Lord when things are inconvenient and frustrating and hard. There are many different types of crosses. One might be indecision about where to go to college, or which career to pursue, or what one's vocation is. Our suffering can also come as a result of our own moral failings, as we suffer the natural consequences of our evil choices. When I'm frustrated with myself and my own personal failings, I think of something St. Therese of Lisieux said when she was literally dying of tuberculosis. She said something unkind to one of the sisters who was caring for her, and again, she is dying of tuberculosis. And one of the other sisters rebuked her for it, to which she replied, "Oh good, another thing to bring to the mercy of God." When we are overcome by our own failings, the only thing we can do is to bring ourselves to his mercy and to stay in his gaze. Sometimes the crosses that we endure result from physical evils, the death or sickness of a loved one, or even a sports injury. These too are opportunities to bring our heartbreak to the cross of Christ, knowing that there is no suffering that we are enduring that he has not first experienced. Once we have identified our cross as a cross, then we need to stay in the struggle. Do not run from the sufferings that Christ has allowed in your life. Stay with him and gaze at him in it. Even if that looks like praying about the same thing every single day, over and over again, and coming to Christ and saying, "I'm still struggling with this thing, help me to endure it." Many times our inclination is to run away, either from the suffering or from Christ. Sometimes people would say, "How could God let this bad thing happen to me?" And then they'll stop praying. But that's where the trouble begins. I can guarantee that you will experience suffering in this life. You can either give it over to the Lord and allow him to help you carry it, or you can reject him and try to carry it on your own. But the suffering will still be there. The choice is yours. Saint Teresa of Avila said, that perseverance was the most necessary thing. In the end, Christ will bring us to heaven if we never give up trying and if we stay in the fight. Suffering is one of the most difficult aspects of living in this world, and it will take a lifetime to learn how to suffer well and with love for Christ. But as long as we recognize our crosses and continually bring them to Him, He will take care of the rest. I'd like to end with, again, Papa B, the main man, Pope Benedict XVI. There are times when the burden of our need and our own limitations might tempt us to become discouraged. But precisely then, we are helped by the knowledge that in the end, we are only instruments in the Lord's hands. In all humility, we will do what we can. And in all humility, we will entrust the rest to the Lord. It is God who governs the world, not we. Thank you.